Hey everyone, and welcome to the deep dive. You guys voted, and today's topic is self-sabotage.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, and we're diving into Brianna Wiest's book, The Mountain Is You. You know that feeling when everything's going great, and then suddenly,
Trip yourself up.
exactly. And in this deep dive, we're not just talking about what self-sabotage is. We're going to figure out why we do it
No.
and what we can do about it. It's like we're climbing that mountain of self-sabotage to find the treasure of self-improvement.
I like that analogy.
Right. So to guide us on this climb, we've got an expert Sherpa with us today.
Happy to be here.
So right off the bat, Weiss kind of flips the script on this idea that self-sabotage is all about punishing ourselves. She says it's actually more about protecting ourselves.
Yeah, it's a fascinating take, right? It's not like there's this good part of us battling a bad part.
It's more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's more like we've got these two desires, one we're aware of, and then this other one that's kind of hidden.
Okay, so let me see if I get this. Let's say I'm working towards a promotion, but deep down, I'm terrified of all the extra responsibility.
So you might accidentally miss deadlines or...
Procrastinate like crazy.
Exactly. And that deeper desire, the one that's driving the self-sabotage, it's usually rooted in some kind of fear. Wyeth uses this example of Carl Jung, the famous psychologist.
Oh, yeah.
Well, as a kid, he hit his head and then started having all these fainting spells. Seems like a medical thing, right?
Yeah, until you find out he wasn't exactly thrilled about going to school.
Bingo! It's like his subconscious was like, hey, here's your get out of school free card.
He traded actual suffering for a whole other set of problems.
And without even realizing it, he called those fainting spells neuroses. It's like we humans are so good at creating problems to avoid facing something scarier.
And that's where the mountain analogy comes in, right?
Yeah.
It represents those conflicting needs inside us.
Exactly. We got to climb that mountain, figure out what those needs are if we want to stop getting in our own way.
Okay, so sometimes it's not that we lack the ability. It's that we're not comfortable with where that ability might take us. Which brings us to something Weiss calls hitting the upper limit.
Yeah.
Ever feel like you're about to reach a big goal and then...
You totally self-destruct.
Yeah.
It happens to the best of us. The idea of more can be terrifying, even if it's something we think we want. It's like, imagine you're used to living in this small apartment and then bam.
You win the lottery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're in this giant mansion. It could be overwhelming, right?
Totally. So that's why Weiss says slow and steady wins the race.
Yeah.
Like if you're decluttering your house, don't try to do it all at once.
Right. Start with a drawer maybe, then a whole shelf, then a closet.
And before you know it, you've tackled the whole house.
It's the same with any goal, really. By focusing on small wins, you're not just making progress, you're also expanding your comfort zone little by little. You're basically training yourself to handle more success, more responsibility, more of whatever you're aiming for.
So we're basically building up our tolerance for good things.
Exactly. And this is especially important when it comes to another sneaky form of self-sabotage.
Ooh, tell me more.
Weiss calls it attachment to what we don't really want. Think about it. How many times do we chase after something that's not truly our own goal?
Like a job title that sounds impressive,
Or staying in a relationship because it's familiar.
even though deep down we're miserable.
Right, we're chasing somebody else's version of success, not our own.
Yeah, waste really encourages us to ask ourselves, am I doing this because I want to or because I think I should want to?
That can be a tough question, especially if you've already spent years on a certain path.
Yeah, you might have to make some big changes.
But, imagine waking up 20 years from now realizing you've been living somebody else's dream.
Hmm. Oof. So self-sabotage can keep us stuck on the wrong path, even when we know it's not leading us anywhere good. But sometimes it's not about the path itself, it's about how we see other people on their paths.
Ah, you're talking about judging others.
Guilty as charged. It's so easy to get caught up in comparison, especially with social media.
Oh yeah, social media definitely doesn't help. But here's the thing. Every time we judge somebody for their success, their happiness, whatever it is we're envious of,
We're kind of reinforcing this idea that those things are bad.
exactly, you might say to yourself, oh, they must be miserable deep down, or they probably stepped on a bunch of people to get there.
And then we start to believe that, so we never even try. It's like we're building these invisible walls around ourselves.
And remember, our brains are wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain.
So if we think success equals pain,
We're going to avoid it like the plague.
okay, so how do we break out of this cycle? Do we need to become like those annoyingly positive people who think everything is sunshine and rainbows?
No, not at all. It's more about remembering that we usually don't have the whole picture.
Right, like Maybe that person worked incredibly hard to get where they are.
Maybe they overcame some huge obstacle.
And that reframing doesn't just make you less judgmental, it can be inspiring.
Exactly. It's like saying, hey, if they can do it, maybe I can too.
Okay, I love that shift in perspective. But speaking of things that can sabotage our potential, Wins talks about pride.
Now, pride isn't always a bad thing, of course. But sometimes it can make us dig in our heels when we should be asking for help or admitting we're wrong.
It's like that business owner who's too proud to admit they need a loan.
And they'd rather watch their business fail than swallow their pride and ask for support.
It's like they're so afraid of appearing weak.
But here's the thing. Admitting you need help is actually incredibly strong. It shows you're willing to learn and grow.
It's about putting the ego aside for the greater good. But sometimes pride isn't even about big decisions.
It can creep into those everyday things like our health habits.
Yeah, like you have this super strict diet, it works great when you have a ton of free time.
But then life gets crazy and you can't keep up.
And instead of just adjusting your plan, you beat yourself up and eventually give up entirely.
And that's where the self-sabotage comes in.
Yeah, it's all about those impossible standards.
But we got to define health on our own terms, Not based on what some magazine or influencer is telling us to do.
Totally. It's about finding what truly nourishes you, both physically and mentally. And speaking of things that can be nourishing or draining, let's talk about another sneaky culprit in the self-sabotage game. The company we keep.
Ooh, good one.
We've all got those people in our lives.
Yeah,
The ones whose energy is just,
a little bit draining.
yeah, it's not always about outright abuse. It's more like this subtle negativity.
That friend who's constantly complaining.
Or that relative who's always making digs at your choices.
You leave feeling drained and full of self-doubt.
Yeah, it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
But here's the thing. You deserve to be around people who lift you up,
Yeah, who celebrate your wins.
who challenge you in a supportive way. Pay attention to how you feel after spending time with someone. If you consistently feel worse, that's a red flag.
It's not about cutting people out, necessarily.
It's about being mindful of your energy and protecting your emotional well-being.
So true. It's like creating a garden. You got to weed out those plants that are sucking the life out of everything else. Speaking of things that can suck the life out of us, let's talk about worrying.
Oh, the good old what if spiral.
Yes, we get addicted to those worst-case scenarios.
Even when logically we know they're super unlikely.
Why do we do that to ourselves?
It's fascinating, right? Wiest suggests those irrational fears are often covering up other fears that we're too scared to look at directly.
So it's like our brains are trying to distract us with those what-ifs so we don't have to face the really scary stuff.
Exactly. It's like being afraid of public speaking, but what you're really afraid of is being judged.
Or rejected.
Right. Often that stems from way back, childhood experiences and things like that.
Okay, so our brain's playing hide and seek with our fears. But how do we actually feel safe? It's one thing to know it's irrational, it's another to actually feel it.
Well, Wiest has this great technique. Instead of fixating on the potential disaster, try picturing someone you admire handling that situation, someone calm and confident.
Oh, so we're borrowing their confidence.
Exactly. Or imagine yourself in that situation, but everything goes perfectly.
Oh, like a mental rehearsal for success?
Exactly. It's about building that confidence and resilience. And this all comes back to emotional intelligence, something Wiest says is key to overcoming self-sabotage. It's not just about knowing what we feel, it's about understanding why we feel it and then choosing how to respond.
Okay, so it's like our emotions are giving us information, but we're in charge of how we use that information.
Exactly. Think of emotional intelligence as a superpower. Imagine, okay, I'm feeling anxious about this presentation. What can I do to manage that?
Deep breaths, visualize yourself totally nailing it.
Exactly. Instead of letting anxiety run the show, you're taking control.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. Past experiences, those limiting beliefs, the company we keep, it can all contribute to self-sabotage. But how do we know if we're actually doing it? What are the signs?
Weiss has some really thought-provoking questions in the book, like, do you spend more time worrying than planning for what you do want?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Think about it. If you're always focused on what could go wrong.
You're not putting that energy into actually making good things happen.
Exactly.
Oh, man. I'm definitely guilty of that one. Okay, what else should we be watching out for?
Well, this one might sting a little. Do you care more about impressing people who don't even like you?
Oh, wow, that's deep. It's like we're seeking validation from the people who are least likely to give it. Why do we do that?
It often comes down to this need for external validation instead of trusting our own judgment.
That's like we're trying to prove something to the wrong audience.
And Winst also asks, are you more afraid of your own feelings than anything else? We all avoid uncomfortable emotions sometimes, but if it's constant, we're basically missing out on a whole part of life.
It's like we're so scared of sadness or anger that we end up numbing ourselves out.
And that actually leads to more self-sabotage in the long run.
So what's the alternative? Do we have to become like emotion processing gurus?
No, it's not about that. White's point is that those feelings, even the uncomfortable ones, they're trying to tell us something.
Like a fire alarm.
Exactly. You wouldn't just ignore a fire alarm. You figure out what's causing it and take action.
So those negative emotions, they're messengers, not monsters.
And each emotion offers clues about what's going on beneath the surface. Like, take jealousy, for example. It can feel awful, but it can also be really insightful.
Okay, so how is being jealous of someone helpful? Seems kind of counterintuitive.
Think about it. When you're jealous, what are you really envious of? Their success, their relationship, their lifestyle.
It's highlighting something that I secretly want.
Exactly. Jealousy can show us what we're denying ourselves. It's not about copying someone else's life.
It's about using that jealousy as fuel to create something amazing for ourselves.
Exactly. And that's where building emotional intelligence comes in. It's about learning to use our emotions as guides instead of letting them control us.
Okay, so we've talked about emotional intelligence a bit, but let's dive a little deeper. What does it actually mean to be emotionally intelligent? And how does it tie into all this self-sabotage stuff?
Imagine your emotions are like this wild horse. Low emotional intelligence is like trying to ride that horse with zero training. You're going to get thrown all over the place. You're making decisions based on impulse.
And that leads to bad choices.
Exactly. But when you build emotional intelligence, it's like you're learning to tame that wild horse. You start to understand its moods. You learn how to guide it.
So you're not suppressing your emotions, you're mastering them.
Exactly. And a big part of mastering your emotions is understanding how your brain works. Wiest gets into some fascinating psychology stuff like confirmation bias and the spotlight effect. These can really contribute to self-sabotage.
Okay, so what do those terms actually mean in real life? Break it down for us.
Confirmation bias is like your brain playing favorites. So let's say you have this belief that you're not good enough.
Oh, I know that one well.
Well, your brain's going to focus on anything that confirms that belief, even if it's totally skewed.
So like I get one critical comment at work,
And suddenly you're a total failure.
even though I've gotten tons of positive feedback.
It's like your brain is ignoring all the good stuff and focusing on that one negative thing.
Yeah, so annoying.
And then you've got the spotlight effect. It's this illusion that everyone is watching us, constantly judging our every move.
I hate that feeling.
Yeah, so even if no one noticed that awkward thing you did, your brain's convinced it's the talk of the town.
It's like we're living under a microscope, and all that anxiety, it just feeds the self-sabotage cycle.
Absolutely, because when you're convinced that everyone is judging you, you're going to play it safe. You avoid risks, you start dimming your own light, you start making choices based on what you think other people will approve of instead of what actually excites you.
Okay, so what's the antidote to all this brain trickery? Do we need to turn into robots?
No, no robots. It's more about building up that critical thinking muscle. Wiest encourages us to question our assumptions.
To be like, hold on, brain, is this thought actually true?
Exactly. It's like becoming a detective, looking for clues that might challenge those self-sabotaging beliefs.
Love that. Okay, so we've explored some of those key factors that contribute to self-sabotage. Irrational fears, negative associations, pride, toxic relationships, and low emotional intelligence. But what can we actually do about it? How do we overcome these patterns and create lasting change?
Well, that's where the rubber meets the road. Wiest offers tons of practical advice, but it all starts with confronting those emotions that we've probably been pushing down for years.
So we've identified the negative thoughts, but now we've got to actually deal with those feelings that are fueling them.
Exactly. It's not enough to just think our way out of self-sabotage. We got to feel our way through it.
Okay, but how? It's one thing to know I'm suppressing anger. It's another to actually feel it in a healthy way.
Well, Wiest's approach is really gentle. First, just notice where you're holding tension in your body. Tight chest, clenched jaw. Those are all clues.
They're like little red flags.
Exactly. And then give yourself permission to actually feel those emotions without judging yourself.
So if I notice I'm carrying a lot of tension in my shoulders, and I realize it's connected to sadness that I've been ignoring,
Just sit with it.
But doesn't that just make it worse?
Actually, the opposite. When you acknowledge those feelings, you take away their power.
So it's like the more we resist, the stronger they become.
Exactly. Emotions are like waves, they come and go. The problem is when we try to fight them, it's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater.
The more you push it down, the more it wants to pop up,
So we got to learn to ride those waves, let the feelings flow through us.
knowing that they'll eventually subside. But
Exactly.
what happens after the wave passes? What do we do with all that emotional energy?
That's where the real transformation begins, and we'll dive into that in part 2 of this deep dive. So we left off talking about riding those waves of emotion, really letting ourselves feel them without judgment. But then what?
Yeah, what happens next? We can't just sit around and like wallow in our feelings forever, right?
Right, and this is where Wist really gets into the actionable stuff. It's not enough to just process emotions. We have to change the behaviors that they're driving.
Okay, so we're taking action based on those feelings. But that can be the hardest part, right?
Yeah.
It's one thing to like intellectually understand I need to change a habit, but then actually doing it's tough.
It is tough, but Wist has this amazing tip. Disconnect action from feeling. Don't wait until you feel motivated or inspired to start working on that project or do whatever it is you've been putting off. Because those feelings, they often come after you've started taking action.
It's like that saying appetite comes with eating.
Exactly. You might not feel like doing it, but once you start, you get into the flow.
The motivation follows. Okay, but what about those deeper issues, like those past experiences that keep tripping us up? We talk about releasing emotional backlog, but that feels kind of abstract. How do we actually do that?
Well, Wiest has this really powerful technique. It involves revisiting those painful memories, but with a twist. Imagine you're back in that situation, where you felt hurt or rejected, but this time you're not that helpless kid anymore.
You're the adult you are now.
Exactly, with all the wisdom and compassion that you've gained.
So it's like time traveling, but you're not just reliving the pain, you're offering your younger self support and validation.
Exactly. You can even imagine releasing those negative emotions into what Wiest calls the quantum field.
The quantum field.
It's sort of like this universal energy field. It's a place where those old hurts can be transformed, like sending those painful memories off to be recycled.
Wow, I love that image.
Yeah.
So it's acknowledging those past experiences and then choosing to let go. But what does moving forward actually look like?
Well, here's the key. It's not about revenge. It's not about trying to prove anything to anyone. True moving forward is about building a life that feels authentic to you, regardless of what other people think. It's about aligning your actions with your values, with your deepest desires.
So we're releasing that need for external validation and really focusing on what makes us feel fulfilled.
Exactly. And that actually reminds me of something else Weiss talks about, visualizing our future selves.
Okay, this sounds a little woo-woo, but I'm intrigued.
Well, it's actually a really powerful technique. Just close your eyes and imagine yourself 5 or 10 years from now. You're living your best life. You're the person you've always wanted to be. What are you doing? Where are you? What are you feeling?
So we're basically borrowing wisdom from our future selves.
Exactly. It's about believing in the possibility of achieving those dreams. But it's more than just daydreaming. How do we bridge that gap between the vision and our current reality?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Well, that's where all those actionable tips come in. Remember that advice about disconnecting action from feeling?
Oh yeah, don't wait to feel motivated, just start taking action.
Exactly. Like, let's say you want to write a book. You don't need to have the whole plot figured out to get started.
Just write one page,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's terrible.
The act of writing will build momentum. And here's another tip that I found super helpful. Practice non-judgment, both for yourself and for others.
It's so easy to be our own worst critics.
It is. But think about it. When you're constantly judging yourself, you're creating this negative feedback loop. You make a mistake, you beat yourself up, and then you're less likely to try again.
Because you're afraid of failing.
Exactly. So instead, Weiss suggests we try to see ourselves with the same kindness that we would offer a friend.
Treat ourselves like we would treat someone we love.
And the same goes for judging other people. Remember, we never really know what battle someone else is fighting.
So true.
Instead of assuming the worst, try assuming you don't have the whole picture. It's about choosing compassion over criticism.
For ourselves and for others.
Exactly. And this actually ties into the idea of defining health on our own terms. It's about finding what truly nourishes us, physically, mentally, emotionally, without comparing ourselves to others.
Finding what works for us.
Exactly. It's about creating a lifestyle that supports our well-being. And that includes embracing our instincts, paying attention to what energizes us, what drains us.
What feels right, what feels wrong.
Exactly. And along with those positive instincts, Weist reminds us to validate our own feelings. We often dismiss our emotions. We tell ourselves we shouldn't feel a certain way
Like we're afraid to admit we're sad or angry.
because we think it makes us weak. But Weist is saying it's okay to feel all the feels.
To embrace the full spectrum of human emotions.
Exactly. And this brings us to something that might sound counterintuitive, especially in our culture of, busyness and productivity. Weist actually emphasizes the importance of scheduling time for play and for doing nothing.
Wait, scheduling time to do nothing. Isn't that like the opposite of being productive?
Think about it. When's the last time you just let yourself truly relax without feeling guilty about it, without checking your phone?
Okay, yeah, it's been a while.
Weist's point is that play and rest aren't luxuries, they're necessities.
So we're talking about taking a walk in the woods or reading a book.
Just giving our minds a break. It's about recharging our batteries so we can show up as our best selves.
Okay, so sometimes doing nothing is actually the most productive thing we can do. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. What's the main takeaway you hope our listener walks away with?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway from Weist's book is this. Self-sabotage is not a personal failing. It's a signal. It's a sign that we have some unmet needs or some limiting beliefs that are driving those patterns.
Like a wake-up call.
Exactly. So instead of beating ourselves up, we need to get curious.
About what's driving those behaviors.
Exactly. And that's where the real work begins. It's about developing self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and self-compassion.
So much help.
Because we all self-sabotage, it's part of being human. The key is to learn from those experiences and choose a different path.
So it's a journey.
It is. It's an ongoing journey of self-discovery.
Love that. Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. Those specific tools and techniques for actually creating lasting change. Okay, so we're back, ready to tackle the last part of this self-sabotage puzzle. We've talked about the why, now it's time for the how. Those tools and techniques for actually overcoming these patterns and making real changes.
This is where Weist's book gets really exciting, I think, because she gives us concrete things we can do. It's not just theory, it's about putting that knowledge into action.
Okay, I am so ready for my action plan. Let's do this.
All right, so Wiest talks about the power of our beliefs. It might sound simple, but the things we believe about ourselves, about the world, they shape our reality. Like if you're constantly telling yourself you're not good enough.
You're going to act in ways that prove it.
Exactly. It's like we create these self-fulfilling prophecies.
But we can rewrite those prophecies, right? We can choose to believe in ourselves and our potential. But how? That's easier said than done.
It is. But one thing Weist suggests is using affirmations. You know those positive statements that counteract those negative beliefs?
Oh, yeah.
It might feel a little silly at first, but repeating phrases like, I am worthy or I am capable.
It can actually change the way you think.
It can. It's like planting these seeds of positivity in your mind.
So it's not just about positive thinking. It's about actively replacing those negative thoughts with something better, something stronger.
Exactly. It's like creating this mental environment that supports growth. Another powerful tool Weist emphasizes is gratitude. And I'm not talking about, toxic positivity.
Or pretending everything's perfect.
Right. It's more about intentionally shifting your focus to the good things in your life, no matter how small they might seem.
So even if I'm having a terrible day,
Yeah.
I can still find things to be grateful for,
Mm.
like having a roof over my head or
A warm cup of coffee.
the support of my loved ones.
Exactly. It's about finding those little glimmers of goodness.
And the more you practice gratitude, the more you start to see things differently.
You start to feel differently.
It's like we're training our brains to look for the good stuff.
Instead of constantly focusing on what's wrong.
If you're always looking through those negative colored glasses,
Everything seems gloomy.
exactly. But when you put on the gratitude glasses, even ordinary things can seem amazing.
And that shift in perspective can be huge when it comes to overcoming self-sabotage. Because when you're feeling grateful, you're less likely to make choices that mess that up.
That makes sense. When you're feeling abundant, you're not acting out of fear or scarcity. Speaking of abundance, Wiest talks a lot about purpose.
Finding your purpose is like discovering your North Star. It gives you direction, it fuels your motivation, it helps you make choices that align with who you truly are. And when your actions are aligned with your purpose, self-sabotage kind of loses its grip.
Okay, that sounds amazing, but Like, how do we actually find our purpose? It feels like this big mysterious thing.
Right. Well, Weiss says it's less about finding it and more about exploring. What lights you up?
What am I passionate about?
What makes you lose track of time? What problems in the world do you feel called to solve?
So it's about connecting with things that make us feel alive.
And it doesn't have to be this grand world-changing thing either. It can be being a great parent, creating beautiful art, whatever brings you joy.
Whatever makes your heart sing. And then we make choices that support that. Which brings us back to relationships, right? Toxic ones can fuel self-sabotage, but healthy ones can be the antidote.
Absolutely. Think of healthy relationships like those nourishing plants in your garden. They give you support,
As
encouragement.
having your own personal cheerleading squad.
Right. But they also challenge you in a good way to help you grow. And one of the most important things in any healthy relationship.
Boundaries.
Yes. Setting those boundaries is crucial.
It's about saying no when you need to.
And not feeling guilty about it.
Recognizing that you deserve respect and your needs matter. And that ties into overcoming self-sabotage too, right?
It does. When we don't value ourselves, we tolerate things from others that we shouldn't.
It's all connected. Wiest also talks about embracing change, which can be tough.
It can. We tend to resist change even when we know it's good for us, but that resistance, it can really hold us back.
It's like clinging to the shore when the tide is pulling you out to sea.
We saying we need to learn to surf those waves.
Because change is inevitable, right?
It is. It's part of life. Fighting it just creates suffering. When we embrace it, we open ourselves up to new possibilities. It's about trusting ourselves, knowing that we can handle whatever comes our way.
Wow. This deep dive has been incredible. We've covered so much. But what's one final thought you'd leave our listener with? Something to think about as they continue on their own self-discovery journey.
I think the biggest takeaway is this. Self-sabotage is not a sign of weakness. It's a signal. It's a sign that there's something deeper going on. Some unmet needs or limiting beliefs that we need to address.
So we could view it as a learning opportunity.
Exactly. It's about developing self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and most importantly, self-compassion. We all do it. The key is to learn from it and choose a different path.
Absolutely. This has been such a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
And all our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights to help you conquer your own personal mountains.
You got this.
Until next time, keep diving deep.